The year was 1943, and the Third Reich found itself in an increasingly precarious position. What had begun as a campaign of swift victories across Europe had transformed into a grueling war of attrition that stretched German resources to their breaking point. In the shadowy corridors of the Reich Ministry of Armaments and War Production, engineers and weapons designers worked frantically to develop solutions that could turn the tide of an increasingly desperate conflict. Berlin in the autumn of 1943 presented a stark contrast to the triumphant capital that had celebrated early victories just 2 years prior. The city bore the scars of Allied bombing campaigns, with rubble-strewn streets and blackened building facades serving as constant reminders of Germany's deteriorating military situation. Air raid sirens had become as common as church bells, and the population had grown accustomed to spending their nights in underground shelters, emerging each morning to survey the latest damage inflicted by British and American bombers. Within this atmosphere of mounting pressure and dwindling hope, the German war machine had begun to explore increasingly unconventional approaches to weapons development. Traditional manufacturing methods, which had once produced the world's most advanced military equipment, were being hampered by critical shortages of raw materials, skilled labor, and time. The luxury of extensive testing and refinement that had characterized German engineering excellence in peacetime was no longer available. Albert Speer, Hitler's architect-turned-armaments minister, had implemented a series of radical reforms aimed at maximizing production efficiency while minimizing resource consumption. These measures had led to remarkable innovations in some areas, but they had also created an environment where experimental and sometimes dangerous weapons concepts could advance from drawing board to battlefield with alarming speed. The concept that would eventually become known as the pipe gun emerged from this crucible of desperation and innovation. Unlike the precision-engineered weapons that had made German arms manufacturers famous worldwide, this new weapon represented a fundamental departure from traditional design philosophy. Instead of complex machinery requiring specialized components and skilled assembly, the pipe gun concept embraced radical simplification, utilizing readily available materials and manufacturing techniques that could be implemented even in improvised workshop conditions. The initial impetus for this unusual weapon came from reports filtering back from the Eastern Front, where German forces were increasingly encountering situations that existing weapons could not adequately address. Urban warfare in cities like Stalingrad had demonstrated the limitations of traditional small arms in close-quarters combat, while the vast expanses of the Russian steppe had revealed the need for weapons capable of engaging targets at unconventional ranges and angles. Dr. Heinrich Langweiler, a relatively obscure engineer working within the Weapons Development Division, had been studying these field reports with growing interest. Langweiler possessed an unusual combination of traditional engineering training and unconventional thinking that made him particularly suited to addressing the unique challenges facing German forces. His previous work had included improvements to existing rifle designs and experiments with alternative ammunition types, but nothing in his background had prepared him for the radical departure he was about to propose. The breakthrough came during a late-night session in his cramped office, overlooking the bombed-out remains of a once elegant Berlin neighborhood. Langweiler had been examining a collection of damaged weapons recovered from various battlefields, trying to understand what made some designs more resilient than others. As he studied a rifle barrel that had been partially destroyed by shrapnel, he began to envision a weapon that could function even under the most adverse conditions. The core concept was deceptively simple: create a weapon so basic in its construction that it could be manufactured using nothing more than standard industrial piping, basic metalworking tools, and readily available components. This weapon would not compete with traditional firearms in terms of precision or rate of fire, but it would offer capabilities that no conventional weapon could match. Langweiler's initial sketches depicted what appeared to be little more than a section of pipe with a crude firing mechanism attached. However, his calculations suggested that this seemingly primitive device could deliver projectiles with sufficient force to be militarily useful, while requiring only a fraction of the resources needed to produce a conventional rifle or machine gun. More intriguingly, the weapon's unconventional design would make it capable of firing a wide variety of improvised ammunition, from standard military rounds to locally manufactured projectiles. The weapon's most unusual characteristic, however, was its intended method of operation. Rather than being held and aimed like a traditional firearm, The pipe gun was designed to be deployed in a fixed position, with its crude sighting system allowing for approximate targeting of distant objectives. The weapon's psychological impact, Langweiler theorized, might prove as valuable as its physical capabilities. As word of Langweiler's concept began to circulate within the weapons development community, it generated reactions ranging from skeptical dismissal to genuine intrigue. Some senior engineers dismissed the idea as a desperate resort unworthy of German technical expertise, while others recognized the potential advantages of a weapon that could be produced quickly and deployed in situations where conventional firearms would be ineffective or unavailable. The debate surrounding the pipe gun concept reflected broader tensions within German military planning during this critical period. Traditional military doctrine emphasized the importance of superior equipment and training, but the realities of total war were forcing German commanders to consider approaches that would have been unthinkable during peacetime. The pipe gun represented more than just an unusual weapon. It embodied a fundamental shift in thinking about how modern warfare might be conducted when conventional resources became unavailable. As autumn gave way to winter in 1943, Langweiler received authorization to construct a working prototype of his unusual weapon. The approval came not from the highest levels of military command, but from middle-ranking officials who had been tasked with exploring any and all options that might provide tactical advantages in an increasingly difficult war. These officials understood that conventional approaches alone would not be sufficient to address the challenges facing German forces, and they were willing to investigate even the most unconventional proposals. The construction of the first prototype took place in a converted workshop on the outskirts of Berlin, far from the main weapons development facilities. Langweiler worked with a small team of machinists and metalworkers, using materials that could be obtained without drawing attention from higher authorities. The secrecy surrounding the project reflected not only the sensitive nature of weapons development, but also the controversial aspects of creating a weapon that deliberately abandoned traditional engineering standards. The completed prototype was both exactly what Langweiler had envisioned and somehow more disturbing than anyone had anticipated. The weapon consisted of a section of steel piping approximately 4 feet in length, mounted on a crude tripod assembly that allowed for basic elevation and traverse adjustments. The firing mechanism was elegantly simple, utilizing a spring-loaded striker that could be activated by pulling a cord from a safe distance. What made the weapon truly unsettling, however, was its complete departure from the familiar forms and functions that defined conventional firearms. There was something deeply unsettling about an object that could deliver lethal force while looking more like a piece of industrial equipment than a military weapon. Even experienced weapons testers found themselves uncomfortable in the presence of the prototype, though none could articulate exactly why the device seemed so threatening. The first test firing took place on a cold December morning at a remote facility north of Berlin. Langweiler and his team had prepared carefully for this moment, selecting a projectile that would demonstrate the weapon's capabilities without revealing too much about its potential applications. As the firing mechanism was activated and the projectile thundered down the steel tube, everyone present understood that they were witnessing something unprecedented in the history of warfare. The results exceeded even Langweiler's optimistic projections, but they also revealed aspects of the weapon's behavior that no one had anticipated. The pipe gun was undeniably effective, but it was also unpredictable in ways that made even its creators nervous about its deployment. As the smoke cleared from that first test firing, the small group of observers realized that they had created something that might be more dangerous to its operators than to its intended targets. The success of the initial prototype testing had an immediate and unsettling effect on everyone involved in the pipe gun project. Dr. Langweiler, who had approached the weapon's development with scientific detachment, found himself increasingly troubled by the implications of what he had created. The weapon functioned exactly as designed, but its operation produced effects that extended far beyond the simple delivery of projectiles to distant targets. The fundamental engineering challenge had been to create a weapon system that could function reliably, despite being constructed from the most basic materials available. Traditional firearms relied on precise tolerances, carefully machined components, and extensive quality control to ensure safe and predictable operation. The pipe gun concept deliberately abandoned all of these conventional approaches in favor of a design that could accommodate significant variations in construction quality while still performing its intended function. The barrel, constructed from standard industrial steel piping, represented the most critical component of the weapon system. Langweiler's calculations had determined that commercially available pipe possessed sufficient strength to contain the explosive forces generated by military ammunition, provided that certain modifications were made to distribute stress more effectively. The pipe's interior was machined smooth to reduce friction and improve projectile accuracy, while the exterior received reinforcement at critical stress points. The firing mechanism represented perhaps the most ingenious aspect of the weapon's design. Rather than attempting to create a complex trigger system that would require precision components and skilled assembly, Langweiler had developed a spring-loaded striker mechanism that could be manufactured using basic metalworking techniques. The system utilized a heavy steel rod held under tension by a collection of industrial springs, which could be released by pulling a cord from a safe distance. This remote activation system had been included not merely for operator safety, but because early testing had revealed that the weapon's discharge produced effects that extended well beyond the immediate vicinity of the target. The pipe gun generated an intense pressure wave that could cause temporary hearing loss or disorientation in anyone standing too close to the weapon when it fired. More disturbing still, the weapon's unusual acoustic signature seemed to have psychological effects that persisted long after the physical sound had dissipated. The ammunition compatibility system represented another area where the pipe gun departed radically from conventional weapon design. Traditional firearms were engineered to function with specific types of ammunition, with careful attention paid to factors such as chamber pressure, projectile weight, and powder charge. The pipe gun's design allowed it to accept virtually any projectile that could fit within its bore, from standard military rounds to improvised devices constructed from available materials. This flexibility came at the cost of predictability, however. Different ammunition types produced vastly different performance characteristics, and the weapon's behavior could vary significantly depending on factors such as projectile weight, explosive charge, and even ambient temperature. Langweiler and his team had developed a series of charts and calculations intended to help operators select appropriate ammunition for specific situations, but these guidelines were necessarily approximate. The weapon's mounting system had evolved considerably from the crude tripod used in early testing. The final design incorporated a more sophisticated base that allowed for precise elevation and traverse adjustments, while still maintaining the simplicity that characterized the overall concept. The mounting hardware utilized components borrowed from existing military equipment, including tripod legs from machine gun mounts and adjustment mechanisms from artillery pieces. One of the most challenging aspects of the weapon's development had been addressing the safety concerns that arose during extended testing. The pipe gun's unconventional design created hazards that had no precedent in existing weapons systems. The remote firing mechanism helped protect operators from the immediate effects of weapon discharge, but it also created new risks related to accidental activation and equipment malfunction. The weapon's recoil characteristics proved particularly problematic. Unlike conventional firearms, which transferred recoil energy directly to the operator's body, the pipe gun transmitted its considerable recoil forces directly to its mounting system and the ground beneath. This created a violent shaking effect that could damage the weapon's alignment and potentially cause injury to anyone in the immediate vicinity. The mounting system had been redesigned multiple times to address these issues, but the fundamental problem remained inherent in the weapon's basic design. Temperature effects represented another area of concern that had not been fully anticipated during the initial design phase. The steel pipe that formed the weapon's barrel was subject to significant thermal expansion when heated by repeated firing, which could affect both accuracy and safety. In cold weather conditions, the metal components became brittle and more susceptible to stress fractures. These temperature-related issues required careful monitoring and maintenance procedures that were difficult to implement under battlefield conditions. The weapon's maintenance requirements had been deliberately minimized during the design process, but certain aspects of the system still required regular attention from trained personnel. The firing mechanism's springs were subject to fatigue and had to be replaced periodically, while the barrel required inspection for stress cracks and other damage. The mounting system's adjustment mechanisms needed regular lubrication and calibration to ensure proper function. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the weapon's engineering was the discovery that certain design modifications could dramatically alter its performance characteristics in unexpected ways. Minor changes to the barrel length, firing mechanism timing, or mounting system configuration could transform the weapon from a relatively predictable device into something far more unpredictable and dangerous. This sensitivity to modification made quality control particularly critical, while simultaneously making it nearly impossible to achieve in the resource-constrained environment where the weapons were being produced. The testing program had revealed that different operators exhibited varying degrees of comfort and competence with the weapons system. Some individuals seemed to develop an intuitive understanding of the device's characteristics and could achieve remarkable accuracy even under challenging conditions. Others found the weapon's behavior so unsettling that they could barely function in its presence, much less operate it effectively in combat situations. These individual variations in operator response had led to the development of a specialized training program designed to identify personnel suitable for pipe gun operations. The training process was unlike anything previously used for conventional weapons, focusing as much on psychological preparation as on technical instruction. Trainees were gradually exposed to the weapon's unusual characteristics, with careful attention paid to identifying individuals who might be adversely affected by prolonged exposure to the device. The training program's most challenging aspect involved preparing operators to function effectively despite the weapon's unpredictable behavior. Unlike conventional firearms, which could be relied upon to perform consistently within known parameters, the pipe gun required operators to adapt continuously to changing performance characteristics. This demanded a level of mental flexibility and stress tolerance that was not required for other weapons systems. As the engineering development process neared completion, Langweiler and his team found themselves confronting ethical questions that had not been apparent during the weapon's initial conception. The pipe gun represented a functional military device that could potentially provide tactical advantages in certain situations, but it also embodied approaches to warfare that challenged fundamental assumptions about how conflicts should be conducted. The weapon's capacity for modification and improvisation made it particularly suited for unconventional warfare applications, but these same characteristics also made it attractive to irregular forces and partisan groups who might use it for purposes far removed from legitimate military operations. The simplicity of its construction meant that the weapon could be reproduced by individuals with minimal technical training, using materials available in most industrial environments. These concerns had led to discussions about whether the weapon should be deployed at all, despite its successful completion of the development process. Some officials argued that the tactical advantages offered by the pipe gun were insufficient to justify the risks associated with its deployment, while others maintained that Germany's desperate military situation required the exploitation of any available advantage, regardless of conventional considerations. By early 1944, the pipe gun project had transitioned from experimental development to limited production, though the weapon's deployment remained shrouded in secrecy and controversy. The German military establishment found itself divided between those who viewed the weapon as a potentially valuable addition to their arsenal and those who considered it a dangerous aberration that violated fundamental principles of military engineering and tactics. The decision to proceed with limited deployment had come from the highest levels of military command, though not without significant debate and reservations. Field reports from various theaters of operation had identified specific tactical situations where conventional weapons proved inadequate, and military planners believed that the pipe gun's unique characteristics might provide solutions to these challenges. However, the weapon's unusual nature had made it impossible to integrate into standard military doctrine, requiring the development of entirely new operational procedures and training protocols. The first production units were manufactured in a converted factory facility outside Munich, where a small workforce of carefully selected technicians assembled the weapons under conditions of extraordinary secrecy. The production process had been designed to minimize the number of individuals who understood the complete weapon system, with different workers responsible for manufacturing specific components without knowledge of how these parts would be assembled into the final device. This compartmentalized approach to production reflected both security concerns and the disturbing effect that extended exposure to the weapon seemed to have on manufacturing personnel. Workers who spent significant time assembling pipe guns reported experiencing anxiety, sleep disturbances, and a general sense of unease that persisted even when they were away from the factory. These effects were initially dismissed as stress-related responses to wartime working conditions, but their consistency across different individuals suggested that something more fundamental might be involved. The quality control process for pipe gun production proved far more challenging than anyone had anticipated. Unlike conventional weapons, which could be tested using standardized procedures to verify their performance, each pipe gun exhibited unique behavioral characteristics that made systematic evaluation extremely difficult. Test firing protocols had to be developed specifically for each weapon, and even then the results provided only limited information about how the device would perform under actual combat conditions. The weapons were initially distributed to specialized units that had been selected for their experience with unconventional equipment and tactics. These units received intensive training not only in the technical aspects of pipe gun operation, but also in the psychological preparation necessary to function effectively with such an unusual weapon system. The training process took significantly longer than had been anticipated, as instructors discovered that traditional military training methods were inadequate for preparing personnel to work with the pipe guns. The first field deployment occurred in the Italian theater, where German forces were conducting defensive operations against advancing Allied armies. The tactical situation seemed ideal for testing the pipe gun's capabilities, as German units were operating from fixed defensive positions and facing enemies advancing across relatively open terrain. The weapon's ability to engage targets at unconventional ranges and angles appeared to offer significant advantages in this environment. The initial combat employment of pipe guns produced results that exceeded tactical expectations, while simultaneously confirming the deepest fears of those who had opposed the weapon's deployment. The devices proved devastatingly effective against their intended targets, but their operation also produced effects that extended far beyond the immediate battlefield. Allied forces reported encountering areas where the very atmosphere seemed charged with menace, even when no enemy forces were visible. More disturbing still were the reports from German units operating the weapons. Personnel assigned to pipe gun operations began exhibiting behavioral changes that became apparent within days of their first exposure to the devices. These individuals became increasingly withdrawn and uncommunicative, avoiding social contact with their fellow soldiers even during rest periods. Medical examinations revealed no physical abnormalities, but psychological evaluations suggested that prolonged exposure to the weapons was having profound effects on the operator's mental state. The weapon's tactical employment required careful consideration of factors that had no precedent in conventional military planning. The pipe gun's effective range varied significantly, depending on ammunition type, weather conditions, and even the time of day. More problematically, the weapon's performance seemed to be influenced by factors that could not be measured or predicted using available scientific methods. Operational reports described instances where identical weapons, loaded with identical ammunition and operated under apparently identical conditions, produced vastly different results. Some weapons consistently achieved remarkable accuracy and effectiveness, while others performed erratically despite careful maintenance and operation. These variations appeared to be related not to mechanical factors, but to more subtle influences that defied rational analysis. The weapon's psychological impact on enemy forces proved to be one of its most significant tactical advantages. Allied units that encountered pipe gun attacks reported experiencing fear and disorientation that persisted long after the immediate threat had passed. These effects appeared to be cumulative, with repeated exposure producing increasingly severe psychological responses that could render entire units combat ineffective. Intelligence reports indicated that Allied forces had begun developing specific procedures for dealing with areas where pipe guns had been deployed. These procedures involved extensive reconnaissance and the use of indirect fire to neutralize suspected weapon positions without requiring direct assault. The effectiveness of these countermeasures suggested that the weapon's psychological impact was having strategic as well as tactical consequences. The logistical support requirements for pipe gun operations proved far more complex than had been anticipated during the development phase. The weapons required specialized ammunition that could not be manufactured using standard production facilities, and the storage and transportation of this ammunition created unique hazards that demanded specially trained personnel and equipment. Maintenance of deployed weapons required the services of technicians who had received extensive training in the weapon's unusual characteristics. These individuals were in extremely short supply, and their assignment to pipe gun units meant that they were unavailable for other critical maintenance tasks. The specialized nature of their training also meant that they could not be easily replaced if they became casualties or were otherwise removed from service. Supply chain management for pipe gun operations required careful coordination between multiple military and civilian agencies, as many of the weapons components were manufactured in different locations, using materials that were also needed for other military applications. The prioritization of these resources created tensions within the broader military production system, particularly as the weapons deployment expanded to additional theaters of operation. The weapons' operational security requirements created additional complications for field commanders. Pipe gun positions had to be carefully concealed not only from enemy observation, but also from friendly forces who had not been briefed on the weapon's existence. This requirement for multiple levels of security made it difficult to coordinate pipe gun operations with other military activities, reducing the overall effectiveness of defensive operations. Communication protocols for units operating pipe guns had to be completely redesigned to account for the weapon's unique characteristics. Standard military radio procedures proved inadequate for coordinating pipe gun operations, as the weapon's effects seemed to interfere with electronic equipment in ways that could not be predicted or controlled. Alternative communication methods had to be developed and implemented, adding another layer of complexity to an already challenging operational environment. The weapons maintenance schedule required adherence to procedures that often conflicted with standard military practices. Pipe guns could not be left unattended for extended periods, as their condition could deteriorate rapidly under field conditions. This requirement for constant attention placed additional burdens on personnel who were already operating under extreme stress in combat environments. Training replacement operators proved to be one of the most significant challenges associated with pipe gun deployment. The specialized training required for effective weapon operation could not be conducted using standard military facilities, and the number of qualified instructors was extremely limited. The establishment of dedicated training facilities required resources that were desperately needed elsewhere, creating ongoing tensions within the military command structure. As reports from the field continued to accumulate, it became increasingly apparent that the pipe gun represented something more than simply an unconventional weapon system. The device seemed to embody principles that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of warfare and the relationship between technology and human behavior. These implications would soon force military planners to confront questions that extended far beyond tactical considerations into realms that had previously been the domain of philosophy and psychology. The summer of 1944 brought disturbing reports from every theater where pipe guns had been deployed. What had begun as isolated incidents of unusual behavior among weapon operators had evolved into a pattern of psychological effects that could no longer be dismissed as coincidental or stress-related. Medical officers across multiple commands were documenting similar symptoms among personnel who had been exposed to the weapons, regardless of their previous military experience or psychological stability. Dr. Friedrich Weber, a military psychologist attached to the Reich Ministry of Health, had been tasked with investigating these reports and determining whether the observed effects posed a threat to military effectiveness. Weber's background in clinical psychology and his previous work with combat stress disorders had prepared him to deal with the psychological toll of warfare, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for what he discovered during his investigation of pipe gun operations. Weber's initial interviews with affected personnel revealed a consistent pattern of symptoms that defied conventional psychological classification. Subjects reported experiencing persistent anxiety that seemed to have no specific focus or trigger. Unlike traditional combat stress, which typically manifested in response to particular threats or traumatic experiences, the anxiety experienced by pipe gun operators appeared to be generalized and continuous, persisting even during periods of relative safety and calm. Sleep disturbances were nearly universal among individuals who had operated the weapons for extended periods. These sleep problems went beyond the insomnia and nightmares commonly associated with combat stress, encompassing a range of phenomena that Weber found difficult to categorize using existing psychological terminology. Subjects reported experiencing dreams that seemed unusually vivid and disturbing, often involving scenarios that bore no resemblance to their actual military experiences. More troubling still were the reports of what subjects described as waking dreams, or periods of altered consciousness that occurred during normal daily activities. These episodes typically lasted only a few minutes, but they left individuals feeling disoriented and anxious for hours afterward. Medical examinations conducted during and after these episodes revealed no obvious physical abnormalities, but electroencephalographic studies suggested that the subject's brain activity was significantly altered during these periods. The social isolation exhibited by pipe gun operators had initially been attributed to the secretive nature of their assignments, but Weber's investigation revealed that the behavior persisted even when security restrictions were relaxed. Affected individuals seemed to lose interest in maintaining relationships with their fellow soldiers, preferring to spend their time alone rather than participating in the social activities that normally provided important psychological support for military personnel. Communication difficulties represented another area of concern that had not been anticipated by military planners. Pipe gun operators gradually became less communicative, not only about their work, but about all aspects of their experience. This communication breakdown made it increasingly difficult to assess their mental state or provide appropriate psychological support. Standard interview techniques proved ineffective, as subjects seemed unable or unwilling to articulate their thoughts and feelings in ways that could be understood by others. Weber's investigation had been complicated by the fact that many of the affected individuals insisted that they were experiencing no difficulties whatsoever. These personnel maintained that their behavior was completely normal and that any observed changes were simply adaptations to their military duties. This lack of insight into their own condition made it nearly impossible to provide effective treatment, as subjects saw no need for psychological intervention. The weapon's effects on personnel appeared to be cumulative, becoming more pronounced with increased exposure to the devices. Individuals who had operated pipe guns for only brief periods showed relatively mild symptoms, while those who had been assigned to the weapons for weeks or months exhibited more severe psychological disturbances. This pattern suggested that the observed effects might be related to some form of conditioning or sensitization process. Attempts to identify individuals who might be naturally resistant to the weapon's psychological effects had met with limited success. While some personnel seemed to tolerate exposure better than others, no clear predictive factors had been identified that could be used for personnel selection. Age, previous military experience, educational background, and psychological testing results all proved to be poor predictors of how an individual would respond to pipe gun assignment. The weapon's effects seemed to extend beyond the immediate operators to include support personnel who worked in proximity to the devices. Maintenance technicians, ammunition handlers, and even clerical staff assigned to pipe gun units began exhibiting similar symptoms, though typically in less severe forms. This observation suggested that the psychological effects might be transmitted through social contact or environmental exposure, rather than being strictly limited to direct weapon operation. Weber had attempted to establish control groups for his research by studying personnel assigned to conventional weapons systems under similar combat conditions. However, these comparison studies were complicated by reports that individuals who had merely been in the vicinity of pipe gun operations seemed to be affected, even if they had no direct contact with the weapons themselves. The apparent ability of the weapon's effects to spread beyond the immediate operational area raised troubling questions about the mechanism responsible for the observed phenomena. Military chaplains working with affected units reported that pipe gun operators frequently sought religious counseling, though they were typically unable to articulate the specific nature of their spiritual concerns. These individuals often described feeling as though they were under a shadow or experiencing some form of spiritual oppression, but they could not explain these feelings in concrete terms. Traditional religious counseling approaches proved largely ineffective, as the subject's distress seemed to be rooted in experiences that fell outside conventional religious frameworks. The weapon's impact on unit cohesion had become a significant concern for field commanders. Military units depend on strong interpersonal bonds and mutual trust to function effectively under combat conditions, but pipe gun operations seemed to undermine these essential relationships. Personnel assigned to the weapons became increasingly isolated from their comrades, while other unit members began to avoid contact with pipe gun operators, apparently sensing that something was fundamentally different about these individuals. Disciplinary problems within pipe gun units had begun to increase significantly by mid-1944, though the nature of these problems was unlike anything experienced with conventional military personnel. Rather than exhibiting typical forms of misconduct, such as insubordination or absence without leave, affected individuals engaged in behaviors that seemed to reflect a fundamental disconnection from normal military life. These behaviors were often subtle and difficult to address using standard disciplinary procedures. Medical officers had attempted to develop treatment protocols for personnel exhibiting pipe gun-related symptoms, but conventional approaches proved largely ineffective. Traditional treatments for combat stress, including rest, counseling, and medication, produced little improvement in affected individuals. Some treatments even seemed to worsen the condition, suggesting that the underlying problem might be fundamentally different from recognized psychological disorders. The investigation had revealed that the weapon's psychological effects were not limited to German personnel. Intelligence reports indicated that Allied forces who had encountered pipe gun attacks were experiencing similar symptoms, though the evidence was necessarily incomplete due to the difficulty of obtaining detailed information about enemy personnel. This observation suggested that the weapon's psychological impact was not related to cultural or linguistic factors specific to German military culture. Weber's preliminary report to military leadership had concluded that the pipe gun's psychological effects posed a significant threat to military effectiveness that might outweigh the weapon's tactical advantages. However, the strategic situation facing German forces in 1944 made it difficult for commanders to abandon any potential advantage, regardless of the associated risks. The debate over whether to continue pipe gun deployment had become increasingly heated as reports of psychological casualties continued to accumulate. The long-term implications of exposure to pipe gun operations remained unknown, as the weapon had been in service for less than a year. Weber had recommended establishing a long-term monitoring program to track affected individuals and assess whether their symptoms might resolve over time, but the practical difficulties of implementing such a program in wartime conditions made it unlikely that comprehensive follow-up studies would be possible. As the psychological investigation continued, it became increasingly apparent that the pipe gun represented something unprecedented in the history of military technology. The weapon seemed to operate according to principles that extended beyond conventional understanding of physics and psychology, suggesting that its development had inadvertently tapped into forces that were not yet understood by modern science. This realization would soon force military planners to confront the possibility that they had created something far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. The autumn of 1944 marked a turning point in the pipe gun program that no one involved in its development could have anticipated. What had begun as an innovative response to military necessity had evolved into something that defied rational analysis and threatened to undermine the very foundations of military discipline and effectiveness. Reports arriving at military headquarters painted a picture of units that were becoming increasingly dysfunctional, not due to enemy action or equipment failure, but because of their exposure to Germany's own experimental weapons. The crisis came to a head during the defense of the Gothic Line in northern Italy, where an entire company equipped with pipe guns had effectively ceased functioning as a military unit. The personnel remained at their positions and continued to operate their weapons, but they had stopped communicating with higher command and seemed to exist in a state of collective withdrawal from normal military life. Attempts to relieve these personnel and rotate them to other duties had met with passive resistance that bordered on the supernatural. Colonel Hans Richter, commanding the 47th Infantry Regiment, had been among the first senior officers to witness the full extent of the pipe gun phenomenon firsthand. Richter was a veteran of multiple campaigns who had dealt with every form of combat stress and military breakdown known to military science, but his encounter with pipe gun operators left him deeply shaken and uncertain about fundamental assumptions regarding military command and control. The colonel's report described personnel who appeared to be physically healthy and mentally alert, but who seemed to exist in a reality that was somehow disconnected from the normal world of military operations. These individuals continued to perform their duties with mechanical precision, but they showed no emotional response to orders, praise, criticism, or even direct threats. It was as though they had become automatons that retained the appearance and basic functions of human beings while losing something essential that made them truly human. Medical examinations conducted on the affected personnel had revealed no physical abnormalities that could account for their condition. Blood tests, neurological evaluations, and psychological assessments all fell within normal ranges, yet the individuals being examined were clearly not functioning normally. Military physicians found themselves confronting a condition that appeared to have no precedent in medical literature and no obvious treatment protocol. The weapon's operational effectiveness had paradoxically increased even as its operators became less responsive to normal military command. Units equipped with pipe guns were achieving tactical results that exceeded expectations, but they were doing so through methods that could not be explained using conventional military doctrine. These units seemed to anticipate enemy movements and respond to threats with an efficiency that suggested access to information that was not available through normal reconnaissance or intelligence channels. Intelligence officers had begun documenting reports from captured Allied personnel, describing encounters with German forces that exhibited behavior unlike anything previously observed in military operations. These accounts described German units that seemed to move and fight with supernatural coordination, as though they were being directed by some form of collective consciousness rather than individual initiative and training. The psychological contagion associated with pipe gun operations had begun to spread beyond the immediate operational units to affect support personnel, headquarters staff, and even civilian populations in areas where the weapons were deployed. Villages near pipe gun positions reported increased rates of anxiety disorders, sleep disturbances, and behavioral abnormalities among residents who had no direct contact with military operations. Dr. Weber's continued investigation had revealed that the weapon's effects seemed to be transmitted through mechanisms that could not be explained using contemporary scientific understanding. Personnel who had never seen a pipe gun or been present during its operation were exhibiting symptoms similar to those experienced by direct operators, apparently through contact with affected individuals or exposure to areas where the weapons had been used. The communication difficulties experienced by pipe gun units had evolved beyond simple reluctance to report or discuss their activities. These units had developed their own methods of internal communication that seemed to bypass normal language entirely. Personnel within affected units appeared to understand each other perfectly despite rarely speaking, while outsiders found it nearly impossible to establish meaningful communication with them. Military intelligence had begun intercepting radio communications from pipe gun units that consisted primarily of silence, punctuated by brief, cryptic transmissions that bore no resemblance to standard military communication protocols. Attempts to decode these transmissions had proven unsuccessful, not because they were encrypted, but because they seemed to follow no recognizable linguistic or logical structure. The weapon manufacturing facilities had begun experiencing similar problems, with production personnel exhibiting behavior patterns that mirrored those observed in field units. Factory workers assigned to pipe gun production had become increasingly isolated and uncommunicative, though their productivity had actually increased. Quality control inspectors reported that weapons produced during this period exhibited unusual characteristics that could not be explained by modifications to the manufacturing process. Supply lines supporting pipe gun operations had become increasingly unreliable, not due to enemy interdiction or logistical failures, but because of behavioral changes among transport personnel and supply officers. These individuals continued to perform their duties, but they did so according to priorities and methods that seemed to have no relationship to official military requirements or standard operating procedures. Field commanders had begun reporting that pipe gun units were operating independently of higher command authority, though not in ways that could be characterized as insubordination or mutiny. These units continued to engage enemy forces and maintain defensive positions, but they did so according to tactical plans that had not been authorized by higher command and that often contradicted official operational orders. The strategic implications of these developments had become impossible to ignore by late 1944. Military planners found themselves confronting the possibility that they had created weapons that were more dangerous to their own forces than to the enemy. The tactical advantages provided by pipe gun operations were being offset by the progressive loss of military discipline and command control within affected units. Attempts to withdraw pipe guns from service and return affected personnel to normal duties had met with unexpected difficulties. Units that had been issued the weapons seemed reluctant to surrender them, while personnel who had been reassigned to other duties exhibited severe psychological distress when separated from pipe gun operations. Several incidents had occurred in which affected individuals had deserted their new assignments and returned unauthorized to their former pipe gun positions. The security implications of the pipe gun phenomenon had begun to concern intelligence officials at the highest levels of military command. The possibility that affected personnel might defect to enemy forces or compromise sensitive information could not be dismissed, though the available evidence suggested that their condition made them unlikely candidates for traditional forms of espionage or sabotage. Military chaplains and medical officers had begun developing joint protocols for dealing with pipe gun-related casualties, though these procedures bore little resemblance to conventional treatments for combat stress or psychological disorders. The approach that seemed most effective involved isolating affected individuals from normal military environments while providing them with structured activities that seemed to satisfy their altered psychological needs. Research into the fundamental principles underlying the pipe gun's effects had been initiated by a joint committee of military engineers, medical officers, and civilian scientists. However, this research program faced significant obstacles, as exposure to the weapons or even detailed study of their design seemed to produce similar psychological effects in research personnel. As 1944 drew to a close, military leadership found themselves confronting a dilemma that had no precedent in military history. The pipe gun program had produced a weapon that was tactically effective but strategically catastrophic, offering short-term advantages while threatening the long-term viability of military operations. The decision of whether to continue, modify, or terminate the program would soon force German commanders to confront questions about the fundamental nature of warfare and the acceptable limits of military innovation. The weapon that had been conceived as a solution to desperate military circumstances had become a problem that threatened to undermine the very foundations of military organization and effectiveness. As reports continued to arrive describing increasingly unusual behavior among pipe gun units, it became apparent that Germany had inadvertently created something far more dangerous than any conventional weapon, a technology that seemed to operate according to principles that lay beyond the boundaries of rational understanding. The winter of 1944-1945 brought Germany to the precipice of defeat, but within the highest circles of military command, attention was increasingly focused not on the advancing Allied armies, but on the growing crisis surrounding their own experimental weapons program. The pipe gun project, which had begun as a promising technological innovation, had evolved into what some officials privately described as a form of technological possession that threatened to consume the very forces it had been designed to protect. General Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the German Armed Forces High Command, found himself presiding over increasingly surreal briefings in which senior officers reported on military units that appeared to be operating according to principles that defied military logic and scientific understanding. The reports described personnel who continued to function as soldiers while exhibiting behavior patterns that seemed to belong more to the realm of folklore than military science. The strategic situation facing German forces had become desperate enough that conventional military wisdom dictated the employment of any available weapon, regardless of associated risks or complications. However, the pipe gun phenomenon presented challenges that extended beyond normal calculations of military risk and benefit. Units equipped with these weapons were achieving remarkable tactical success, but they were simultaneously becoming disconnected from normal military command and control in ways that threatened the coherence of entire army groups. Intelligence reports from the Eastern Front described entire divisions that had been equipped with pipe guns and had effectively vanished from the normal military chain of command while continuing to engage Soviet forces. These units appeared on no official roster and responded to no direct orders. Yet they continued to inflict significant casualties on advancing Red Army units through methods that Soviet commanders found incomprehensible and terrifying. The manufacturing program for pipe guns had been quietly expanded during the final months of 1944, despite growing concerns about the weapon's effects on personnel. Production facilities had been established in underground factories that were immune to Allied bombing. But these facilities had become isolated communities that operated according to their own internal logic rather than official production schedules and quality control standards. Workers in these underground facilities had developed a form of collective consciousness that enabled them to coordinate complex manufacturing processes without verbal communication or written instructions. Production efficiency had increased dramatically, but the weapons being produced exhibited characteristics that had not been specified in the original design documents and that could not be explained by the engineering personnel who attempted to analyze them. Dr. Weber's psychological investigation had been expanded to include a team of researchers drawn from universities and medical institutions across Germany, though recruitment had proven difficult as many qualified individuals declined to participate after learning the nature of the research. Those who did join the investigation team often experienced psychological changes similar to those observed in pipe gun operators, raising questions about whether the weapon's effects could be transmitted through academic study as well as direct exposure. The research team had documented cases in which individuals who had merely read detailed reports about pipe gun operations began exhibiting symptoms similar to those experienced by actual weapon operators. This observation suggested that the psychological effects might be transmitted through information itself, rather than requiring physical proximity to the weapons or contact with affected personnel. Medical facilities treating pipe gun casualties had been forced to develop entirely new approaches to patient care, as traditional psychiatric treatments proved not only ineffective, but potentially harmful to affected individuals. Patients seemed to respond positively to treatment environments that incorporated elements reminiscent of pipe gun operations, including exposure to certain types of sound and mechanical vibration that mimicked the weapon's operational characteristics. The theological implications of the pipe gun phenomenon had begun attracting attention from religious authorities within Germany and in neutral countries. Several prominent theologians had published papers suggesting that the weapons might represent a form of technological blasphemy that violated fundamental spiritual principles governing the relationship between human consciousness and divine authority. Military chaplains working with affected units had reported experiencing profound spiritual crises that seemed to challenge their fundamental understanding of religious doctrine and practice. These individuals described encounters with pipe gun operators as spiritually disturbing, in ways that could not be explained using traditional religious frameworks, leading to a significant increase in requests for transfer among chaplains assigned to units equipped with the experimental weapons. The logistical requirements for supporting pipe gun operations had evolved into a parallel supply system that operated independently of normal military logistics. Personnel assigned to these supply operations had developed their own methods for identifying and prioritizing requirements that bore no resemblance to standard military procedures, yet which seemed to anticipate operational needs with uncanny accuracy. Transportation networks supporting pipe gun units had become increasingly isolated from normal military traffic, with drivers and logistics personnel avoiding routes that served these units whenever possible. Those who were required to make deliveries to pipe gun positions reported experiencing anxiety and disorientation that persisted for days after completing their assignments. The security classification of the pipe gun program had been elevated to the highest levels of military secrecy, not only to protect technological advantages, but also to prevent the spread of information that might trigger psychological effects in personnel who had not been directly exposed to the weapons. Security officers had documented cases in which detailed briefings about pipe gun operations had produced symptoms similar to actual exposure in individuals who had no previous knowledge of the weapons. Allied intelligence services had begun developing specific procedures for dealing with areas where pipe guns had been deployed, recognizing that conventional military tactics were ineffective against units equipped with these weapons. Allied forces had learned to avoid direct confrontation with pipe gun units whenever possible, preferring to bypass these positions rather than risk the psychological casualties that seemed to result from prolonged contact with affected German personnel. The diplomatic implications of the pipe gun program had begun to concern neutral observers and international organizations that monitored military developments for potential violations of international law. While the weapons themselves did not appear to violate existing treaties governing warfare, their psychological effects raised questions about whether they might constitute a form of inhumane weapon that caused unnecessary suffering. Research into countermeasures against pipe gun operations had been initiated by allied scientific organizations, though these efforts were hampered by the difficulty of studying the weapons without risking exposure to their effects. Captured pipe gun units had proven nearly impossible to analyze, as they seemed to retain their psychological influence even when inactive and separated from their original operators. The economic impact of the pipe gun program had become significant enough to affect Germany's overall war production capabilities. Resources diverted to pipe gun manufacturing and support operations were no longer available for conventional weapons production, while the psychological effects on industrial workers were beginning to affect productivity in factories that had no direct connection to the experimental weapons program. Quality control procedures for pipe gun production had been abandoned as conventional inspection methods proved inadequate for evaluating weapons whose performance characteristics seemed to change depending on factors that could not be measured using available scientific instruments. Production facilities had developed their own internal standards for determining weapon acceptability, using criteria that bore no relationship to original engineering specifications. The training program for pipe gun operators had evolved into something resembling a form of indoctrination rather than conventional military instruction. Training facilities had become isolated compounds where personnel spent weeks or months developing the psychological characteristics necessary for effective weapon operation, often emerging from training as fundamentally changed individuals who could no longer function effectively in normal military environments. Personnel rotation policies for pipe gun units had been modified to reflect the reality that individuals assigned to these weapons could not be effectively reassigned to other duties. Pipe gun operators had become a permanent caste within the military structure, isolated from other personnel and operating according to their own internal hierarchy and command structure. As the war entered its final phase, military leaders found themselves confronting the possibility that the pipe gun program had achieved a form of technological autonomy that made it impossible to control or terminate through conventional administrative means. The weapons and their operators had become a self-perpetuating system that continued to function independently of official policy or strategic direction, representing a form of military evolution that had never been anticipated by those who had initiated the program. The pipe gun phenomenon had demonstrated that technological innovation could produce consequences that extended far beyond the intended applications, creating changes in human behavior and social organization that might prove more significant than any tactical advantages gained through the weapons deployment. As Germany faced inevitable defeat, the question of what would happen to pipe gun units and their operators in the post-war period became a matter of urgent concern for military planners and civilian authorities alike. The collapse of Nazi Germany in May 1945 brought an end to conventional warfare in Europe, but it marked the beginning of a different kind of struggle for Allied forces tasked with occupying German territory and accounting for the technological innovations that had been developed during the war's final phase. Among the most puzzling discoveries made by advancing Allied armies were installations and personnel associated with the pipe gun program, which presented challenges that conventional military occupation procedures had not anticipated. Allied intelligence teams entering Germany in the spring of 1945 had been briefed to watch for advanced weapons technology that might be captured and studied for potential military applications. However, the pipe gun installations they discovered defied conventional analysis and seemed to resist standard documentation and cataloging procedures. Military engineers and weapons experts found themselves confronting devices that appeared deceptively simple, yet behaved in ways that challenged fundamental assumptions about mechanical engineering and ballistics. The personnel associated with pipe gun operations presented an even greater puzzle for Allied occupation forces. These individuals appeared physically healthy and responded to basic commands, but they seemed to exist in a psychological state that made normal interaction extremely difficult. Attempts to interrogate former pipe gun operators about their activities and the weapons capabilities produced little useful information, as these individuals seemed unable or unwilling to communicate effectively about their experiences. Major Robert Harrison of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers had been assigned to lead a team investigating German experimental weapons, and his encounter with a pipe gun installation near Munich provided his first indication that this assignment would be unlike anything in his previous military experience. The facility appeared to be a standard weapons testing ground, but personnel working there exhibited behavior that Harrison found deeply unsettling despite his inability to identify any specific threat or danger. The technical documentation for pipe gun operations proved to be unusually sparse and difficult to interpret, not because it had been destroyed or classified, but because it seemed to have been written according to principles that bore little resemblance to conventional engineering practices. Design specifications included references to factors and measurements that could not be correlated with standard scientific instruments, while operational procedures described processes that seemed to violate basic principles of physics and mechanics. Attempts to operate captured pipe guns under controlled conditions met with limited success, as the weapons seemed to require operators who possessed specific psychological characteristics that could not be easily replicated. Allied personnel who attempted to fire the weapons reported experiencing immediate and severe psychological distress, while the weapons themselves often malfunctioned in ways that suggested they were somehow attuned to the mental state of their operators. The psychological evaluation of former pipe gun personnel became a priority for Allied medical officers who were concerned about the potential long-term effects of exposure to experimental German weapons. However, standard psychiatric assessment procedures proved inadequate for evaluating individuals whose conditions seemed to fall outside recognized categories of mental illness or psychological disorder. Dr. Margaret Thornton, a British psychiatrist attached to the Allied occupation forces, had been tasked with developing treatment protocols for German personnel who had been exposed to experimental weapons. Her work with former pipe gun operators led her to conclude that these individuals had undergone psychological changes that might be permanent and that conventional therapeutic approaches were unlikely to produce significant improvement. The social integration of former pipe gun personnel into post-war German society proved extremely problematic. These individuals seemed unable to maintain normal relationships or employment, preferring to remain isolated from mainstream society. Many congregated in small communities where they could interact with others who had shared similar experiences, creating enclaves that operated according to their own internal logic and social structures. Allied intelligence services had attempted to recruit former pipe gun personnel as sources of information about German weapons development, but these efforts met with little success. The affected individuals seemed to possess detailed knowledge about advanced technologies, but they were unable or unwilling to communicate this information in ways that could be understood by conventional intelligence analysts. The disposal of captured pipe guns presented unexpected challenges for Allied military authorities. Standard procedures for destroying captured weapons proved ineffective, as the devices seemed to resist conventional demolition methods. Attempts to dismantle the weapons for study often resulted in equipment failures and personnel injuries that could not be explained by normal safety considerations. Several research programs were initiated by Allied scientific organizations to study the principles underlying pipe gun technology, but these efforts were hampered by the psychological effects that seemed to be associated with detailed study of the weapons. Research personnel frequently reported experiencing anxiety and disorientation that made it difficult to conduct systematic investigation, while some researchers requested reassignment after relatively brief exposure to pipe gun-related materials. The security classification of information related to pipe guns was elevated to the highest levels within Allied governments, not only to protect potential military applications, but also to prevent the spread of information that might trigger psychological effects in personnel who had not been previously exposed to the technology. This classification policy made it difficult to coordinate research efforts between different organizations and countries. International monitoring organizations had begun documenting reports of unusual phenomena in areas where pipe guns had been deployed during the war. Local populations in these regions reported experiencing persistent anxiety and behavioral changes that seemed to be connected to their proximity to former weapons installations, suggesting that the effects of pipe gun operations might have environmental as well as psychological components. The long-term medical monitoring of individuals who had been exposed to pipe gun operations revealed patterns of health effects that could not be explained using conventional medical knowledge. While affected individuals showed no obvious physical symptoms, they exhibited subtle changes in brain activity and psychological function that seemed to be permanent and that did not respond to available treatments. Educational institutions in the post-war period began encountering students and faculty who had been exposed to pipe gun operations during the war. These individuals often possessed unusual insights into advanced physics and engineering concepts, but they were unable to communicate their knowledge effectively or integrate it with conventional academic frameworks. Some universities established special programs to accommodate these individuals, though with limited success. The economic impact of pipe gun-related psychological effects became apparent in the years following the war, as communities with significant numbers of affected individuals experienced reduced productivity and social dysfunction that persisted long after the immediate effects of warfare had been addressed. Regional development programs were required to address these ongoing challenges, though conventional approaches to economic development proved largely ineffective. Religious organizations in post-war Germany found themselves dealing with former pipe gun personnel who sought spiritual guidance for experiences that seemed to fall outside traditional religious frameworks. These individuals often described feeling as though they had been fundamentally changed by their wartime experiences, but they were unable to articulate the nature of this change in ways that could be addressed through conventional pastoral care. Archaeological investigations of former pipe gun installations revealed evidence of unusual environmental effects that persisted long after the weapons had been removed. Soil and vegetation in these areas exhibited characteristics that could not be explained by conventional scientific analysis, while sensitive individuals reported experiencing psychological distress when visiting these locations even decades after the war's end. The influence of pipe gun technology on post-war weapons development remained a closely guarded secret within military establishments of major powers, though some researchers privately acknowledged that certain advanced weapon systems incorporated principles that had been derived from study of captured German experimental weapons. The full extent of this technological transfer remained classified long after the original security justifications had become obsolete. Mental health professionals working with war veterans began documenting cases of individuals who claimed to have encountered German forces equipped with unusual weapons that had produced lasting psychological effects. While many of these accounts were initially dismissed as combat stress reactions, the consistency of symptoms across different individuals and theaters of operation suggested that these reports might have a factual basis. The families of individuals who had been involved in pipe gun operations often experienced psychological effects that seemed to be transmitted through close contact with affected relatives. Children of former pipe gun operators frequently exhibited behavioral patterns that resembled those of their parents, despite having no direct exposure to the weapons or wartime experiences. As the decades passed, the pipe gun phenomenon became the subject of classified research programs within intelligence agencies of major powers. Though these investigations were hampered by the continuing psychological effects associated with study of the technology, the full extent of the weapons' capabilities and their long-term effects on human consciousness remained subjects of speculation rather than scientific understanding. The legacy of the pipe gun program served as a cautionary tale about the unpredictable consequences of military innovation, demonstrating that technological advancement could produce effects that extended far beyond intended applications. The weapons had achieved their immediate tactical objectives, but they had also created changes in human behavior and consciousness that proved to be irreversible and that continued to influence individuals and communities long after the original military conflict had ended. In the archives of military history, the pipe gun represents one of the most disturbing examples of technological innovation during World War II. Unlike the well-documented rocket technology, jet engines, and other German innovations that would later influence post-war development, the pipe gun program remained classified for decades, its existence known only to a small circle of military historians and intelligence analysts. The weapon's ultimate fate remains unclear. Allied forces dismantled known production facilities and attempted to account for all manufactured units, but incomplete records and the secretive nature of the program made comprehensive accounting impossible. Some researchers believe that pipe gun technology influenced certain post-war weapons development programs, though the full extent of this influence remains classified. The human cost of the pipe gun program extended far beyond the immediate casualties of warfare. Thousands of individuals who were exposed to the weapons during their development, production, and deployment experienced long-term psychological effects that conventional medicine was unable to address. Many of these individuals struggled with social integration throughout their post-war lives, forming isolated communities that maintained their own support networks and social structures. The scientific principles underlying the pipe gun's unusual effects have never been fully understood. While conventional analysis revealed nothing unusual about the weapon's mechanical construction, their operational characteristics suggested the influence of factors that could not be measured using available scientific instruments. This gap between observable effects and theoretical understanding has made the pipe gun a subject of ongoing classified research within military and intelligence organizations. The pipe gun phenomenon serves as a reminder that technological innovation can produce consequences that extend far beyond intended applications. In the desperate circumstances of total war, the normal safeguards that prevent dangerous technologies from being deployed were abandoned in favor of short-term tactical advantages. The long-term costs of these decisions continued to affect individuals and communities for decades after the original military conflict had ended. Today, the pipe gun exists primarily as a classified footnote in military history, its legacy preserved in sealed archives, and the memories of aging individuals who experienced its effects firsthand. The weapon's story serves as a cautionary tale about the unpredictable nature of technological development and the importance of considering long-term consequences when pursuing military innovations under pressure of desperate circumstances. The full truth about the pipe gun program may never be known, as many records remain classified, and most individuals with direct knowledge of the weapons have passed away. However, the program's legacy continues to influence discussions about the ethical boundaries of military research and the responsibility of scientists and engineers to consider the broader implications of their work. In the end, the pipe gun represents more than simply an unusual weapon from World War II. It stands as a testament to human ingenuity, twisted by the pressures of total war, and a reminder that some innovations carry costs that extend far beyond their immediate military applications. The shadows cast by this strange weapon continue to influence our understanding of technology, warfare, and the complex relationship between human consciousness and the tools we create.